Two thugs on a Chicago bus thought they could bully a terrified nurse without consequence. Then they made the fatal mistake of kicking the quiet German shepherd sitting nearby. They didn't realize the dog belonged to Mason, a Navy SEAL. Mason took them down in seconds, but he had no idea that this simple act of justice would drag him into a much bigger, deadlier war. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The wind whipping off Lake Michigan carried a biting chill that seemed to ignore the layers of clothing Mason Lewis wore, a frigid reminder that he was back in Chicago. It was a gray, steel-colored afternoon in late November, the kind of day where the sky and the concrete skyline seemed to merge into a single oppressive sheet of slate. Mason, a 32-year-old Navy SEAL currently on a mandatory leave, he hadn't asked for, stood on the cracked pavement of a bus stop on the outskirts of the city. He was a man of imposing physical stature, standing well over 6 feet with a build that suggested coiled power, yet his demeanor was intensely quiet. His face, weathered slightly by sun and sand from deployments far from this frozen city, bore a short, well-groomed beard and eyes the color of flint that scanned the street with habitual vigilance. Beside him sat Echo, a large, sable-coated German shepherd with a thick leather collar. Echo was not merely a pet. He was a retired military working dog with a notched ear and a discipline that matched his handler's sitting perfectly still despite the biting wind, his golden eyes tracking the passing traffic. They were stranded Mason's reliable pickup truck, having suffered a catastrophic radiator failure 3 miles back, forcing them onto public transit to reach his brother's apartment downtown. The bus arrived with a groan of hydraulics and a squeal of brakes, the doors hissing open to reveal a blast of stale, heated air. The driver, a heavy-set man with weary eyes and a name tag that read, Bernie, looked skeptically at the large dog. "You got a ticket for that beast?" Bernie asked, his hand hovering over the door lever. Mason didn't blink, reaching into his pocket to flash his military identification service animal. Mason said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that brokered no argument. "He's cleaner than most people." Bernie grunted, too tired to argue with a man who looked like he could dismantle the fare box with his bare hands. "Fair enough. Just keep him out of the aisle. I don't need a lawsuit today." Mason nodded his thanks and moved to the rear of the bus, his movements fluid and efficient, signaling Echo to heel close to his leg. They took a seat near the back exit, Mason positioning himself so he had a clear view of the entire interior. The bus was sparsely populated. Across the aisle sat a young woman who looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days. She was Eleanor Rossetti, a medical student in her mid-20s, with dark curly hair tied back in a messy bun and wearing light blue scrubs under a heavy winter coat. Her head was leaning against the vibrating window, eyes closed. Mason watched her for a moment before the bus lurched to a halt. At the next stop, 2 young men boarded, bringing a gust of noise and chaotic energy with them. The first, Rico, was wiry and agitated, wearing a flashy, oversized jacket. Trailing him was Jay Bone, a towering hulk of a man in a dark hoodie. "Man, it is brick out there," Rico shouted, slapping his hands together as he bypassed the fare box. "Hey, driver, crank the heat up, will you? We're freezing back here." Bernie sighed but said nothing. Focusing on the road, the 2 thugs moved to the back, their eyes scanning for entertainment. They spotted Elena. Rico slid into the seat directly behind her, leaning forward. "Hey, sleeping beauty." Rico said, his voice loud and mocking, "You miss your stop, or you just waiting for me?" Elena's eyes snapped open. Startled, she pulled her coat tighter, shifting her body toward the window. "I'm fine, thanks," she murmured, her voice tight with exhaustion. "Oh, just leave me alone." Rico laughed, looking at Jay Bone for validation. "Leave you alone? I'm just being polite. You look like you need a friend, doesn't she? Look lonely." "Jay?" Jay Bone grunted, looming over the aisle. "Yeah, lonely." Rico reached out, flicking the back of her hair. "You a nurse or something? You think you're better than us 'cause you got a job." Elena swatted his hand away, turning to face him. "Don't touch me," she said louder. This time, I asked you nicely. Oh, she's got claws, Rico jeered, standing up to block her path. I like that, come on. Give me a smile. Just one smile, and we'll leave you alone. Isn't that a fair trade? The tension on the bus was suffocating. People stared at their phones, terrified of intervening. Mason felt the familiar cold tightening in his chest. He turned his head slowly. She said, "She's not interested?" Mason said his voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the bus like a razor blade. Rico froze, then slowly turned his head to look at Mason. "Excuse me." Rico sneered, stepping into the aisle to face the soldier. "I don't remember asking the peanut gallery. You got a problem, Mountain Man?" "No problem," Mason replied evenly, his hand resting lightly on Echo's neck to keep the dog steady. "Just seems like the lady wants a quiet ride." "We all do," Rico scoffed, looking Mason up and down, trying to find a weakness. "You think you're tough, 'cause you got a beard and a flannel shirt," Rico taunted. Stepping closer, "You look like a lumberjack who got lost." J-Bone stepped up beside Rico, looking at Echo. The dog let out a low, vibrating growl. "I hate dogs." J-Bone rumbled, his voice thick and dull, "especially ugly ones." Mason's eyes narrowed slightly. "He's not bothering you? Step back or what?" Rico challenged, pumped full of adrenaline and bravado. "You gonna sick your mud on us? I bet I can kick that dog's teeth in before he even moves." J-Bone took this as a command. "Let's see." The giant said. He drew his heavy steel-toed boot back, aiming directly at Echo's ribs. "No," Elena shouted from her seat. "But the pie." E-Boot was already moving. Mason didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He simply acted. Mason rose from his seat in a blur of motion. His left hand shot out, snatching J-Bone's kicking leg out of the air with a grip like an iron vice bad idea. Mason whispered in one fluid motion. He drove a palm strike into the giant solar plexus while twisting the captured leg. J-Bone made a choking sound as the air left his lungs, and Mason swept his standing leg out from under him. The giant crashed to the metal floor with a bone-shaking thud. Rico shrieked, fumbling for a pocket knife. "You crazy freak!" he yelled. Mason didn't even look at the weapon. He pivoted, grabbing Rico by the collar and the belt, and slammed him into the empty plastic seat opposite him. Mason pinned Rico there with a forearm against the throat, applying just enough pressure to terrify him without crushing the windpipe. "We're going to have a quiet ride. Now?" Mason said, his face inches from Rico's. "Do you understand, Rico?" Eyes were bulging, his hands scrabbling uselessly at Mason's arm. "Okay. Okay, man, I get it. I can't breathe." Mason eased the pressure slightly, "And you're going to apologize to the lady." Rico nodded frantically. "I'm sorry, lady, I'm sorry. Just get him off me." Mason stepped back, releasing him. Rico scrambled up, grabbed the wheezing J-Bone by the hood, and dragged him toward the back door driver. "Open the door," Rico screamed. Bernie slammed on the brakes and popped the exit. The two thugs tumbled out onto the sidewalk, cursing and gasping. Mason sat back down, adjusting his baseball cap, which hadn't moved an inch. During the altercation, he looked at Echo, who was sitting calmly waiting for a command. "Good boy," Mason murmured. He looked across the aisle. Elena was staring at him, her hands trembling. "Are you okay?" Mason asked, his voice returning to its quiet baseline. Elena swallowed hard, nodding. I think so. Thank you. You didn't have to do that." Mason shrugged, looking out the window as the bus began to move again. "I didn't do it for you," he say. Simply, though his tone wasn't unkind, "I just wanted a quiet ride." He noticed several phones held up in the air a few rows ahead, recording. He pulled the brim of his hat lower. The city of Chicago rolled by outside, cold and indifferent, but inside the bus, the air felt a little lighter. The bus ride from the outskirts into the denser, more suffocating grid of the city center had done little to warm Mason Lewis's bones. The adrenaline from the altercation with the thugs had faded, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that he couldn't quite suppress a soldier's intuition that something was fundamentally wrong. By the time he and Echo stepped off the bus a few blocks from his brother's apartment complex, the sun had fully set, plunging Chicago into a prematurely dark evening, illuminated only by the sickly orange glow of sodium streetlights. The wind howled through the concrete canyons, carrying with it the scent of exhaust, wet pavement, and decaying leaves. Mason adjusted his backpack and tightened his grip on Echo's leash, moving with a purposeful stride toward the spire. A mid-range apartment building that had seen better days. His brother Ethan was an investigative journalist who lived for the story often at the expense of his own safety and comfort, a trait that worried Mason constantly upon entering the lobby. Mason noticed the security guard was missing from his post, the small desk empty and covered in a layer of neglected mail. The elevator was out of order. A yellow maintenance sign taped haphazardly across the doors, forcing Mason to take the stairs to the 4th floor. As he climbed, the silence of the building felt heavy, unnatural, for a complex that should have been bustling with evening activity. When he reached the 4th floor landing, Echo stopped abruptly. The dog's ears swiveled forward, the fur along his spine, rising in a jagged ridge. A low, menacing growl rumbled deep in Echo's chest, a warning that Mason took seriously. Mason drew a small tactical flashlight from his pocket, clicking it on as he approached apartment 4B. The door was not just unlocked, the frame was splintered around the lock mechanism, pushed inward by brute force. Mason signaled Echo to stay low and pushed the door open with his boot, stepping into the darkness. The apartment had been tossed. Bookshelves were overturned, cushions were slashed, and papers were scattered across the floor like snow. It looked like a hurricane had been confined to the living room, but Mason's eyes were drawn to the figure lying prone near the kitchen island. It was Ethan. Mason rushed forward, dropping to his knees, his hands instantly checking for a pulse that he knew wouldn't be there. Ethan's skin was cold. There were bruises on his face and a single fatal gunshot wound to the chest. The scene had been staged clumsily to look like a robbery gone wrong, a wallet thrown open, a TV missing, but Mason saw the precision of the kill. This was an execution. A wave of grief hit Mason hot and suffocating, but he shoved it down into a steel box in his mind. He couldn't mourn yet. He had to survive before Mason could process the scene further. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. He stood up, hands raised, as 2 uniformed officers and a man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit entered the apartment with guns drawn, police hands. "Where I can see them," the suited man barked. This was Detective Miller, a man in his 50s with a paunch that strained the buttons of his shirt, a face ruddy from years of poor diet, and eyes that held a profound, cynical exhaustion. Miller holstered his weapon once he saw Mason's military ID, but his attitude remained hostile. He walked around the body, stepping carelessly over the scattered papers. "Looks like a junkie break-in," Miller stated flatly, pulling out a notepad. "Kid, probably surprised them. Shame we see this 10 times a week. In this district." Mason stared at the detective, incredulous. "A junkie doesn't shoot center mass with a double tap," Mason said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "And they don't ignore it. Hey, the laptop sitting right there on the desk. This was a hit?" Miller scoffed, chewing on a toothpick look. "Soldier, I know you're grieving, but leave the police work to the police. Your brother had a reputation for poking his nose where it didn't belong. Maybe looking for a score?" "We found traces of heroin in the bedroom." Mason stepped forward, looming over the shorter man. Ethan didn't touch. "Drugs? He was a journalist. He was working on something big." Miller poked a finger into Mason's chest. "He was a casualty of the city. We're closing this as a robbery. Homicide don't make trouble, or I'll have you brought in for interfering with a crime scene. Now get out," forced out of the apartment. Mason walked into the cold night. His mind racing, he knew Miller was either incompetent or paid off. He needed a lead. He stopped under a flickering streetlight and looked down at Echo. He remembered the package Ethan had sent him 2 weeks ago, a care package for the dog. It had contained a new heavy-duty tactical collar, which Echo was wearing right now. The note had been cryptic: for the heavy loads, keep it close to your chest. Mason knelt examining the collar, running his fingers along the thick nylon stitching of the interior padding. He felt a small, hard lump using a small pocket knife. He carefully sliced the seam. A black micro SD card slid into his palm. Ethan hadn't just sent a gift. He had sent the evidence Mason needed, a secure place to view the data somewhere anonymous. He found a 24-hour internet cafe called the Neon Spider. A few blocks away, it was a relic of the early '2 smelling of energy drinks and ozone, filled with gamers wearing headsets. Mason paid cash for a private booth in the back. He inserted the card into the computer, his heart hammering against his ribs. The drive was encrypted, but the password was simple. Ethan's childhood nickname for Mason. The files opened. It wasn't just a story, it was a dossier. The header read, Project Ares photographs, shipping manifests, and emails flooded the screen. They detailed a massive illegal operation run by Black Ridge, a private military contractor supposed to be providing security for relief efforts. Instead, they were smuggling military-grade weapons, anti-tank missiles, experimental drones, automatic rifles into the city to sell to cartels. Mason was so engrossed in the horror of the discovery that he almost missed the reflection in the dark monitor screen outside the cafe window. A black SUV had pulled up silently. 3 men got out. They weren't police and they weren't street thugs. They moved with the synchronized precision of a tactical team, wearing dark tactical gear and carrying suppressed weapons. The leader, a man named Vance with a shaved head and a scar running through his eyebrow, signaled to the others to flank the entrance. Mason ripped the SD card from the computer and kicked the chair back Echo heel. He commanded, his voice low and urgent. The front glass of the internet cafe shattered inward as the first suppressed shot took out the monitor Mason had been using, just a second before panic erupted in the cafe. Gamers screamed and scrambled for cover. Mason didn't freeze. He grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and hurled it through the back emergency exit door, creating a diversion before sprinting toward the kitchen area. Echo, sticking to his side like a shadow gunfire, chewed up the drywall behind them. They were hunting him. Ethan had been killed for this, and now the crosshairs were on Mason. He burst out into the alleyway, the cold air hitting his face, but there was no time to breathe. He had the truth in his pocket and an army of mercenaries on his heels. The silent guardian had just become the prey. The alleyway smelled of wet cardboard and old grease. A stark contrast to the sterile freezing wind whipping through the main streets of Chicago. Mason Lewis leaned heavily against the brick wall of a dumpster enclosure, his breath hitching in his chest, the graze on his left shoulder, a parting gift from the Mercena. Rise at the internet cafe burned with a white-hot intensity. It wasn't life-threatening. The bullet had merely furrowed the deltoid muscle, but it was bleeding freely, soaking the sleeve of his flannel shirt and dripping onto the dirty snow. Beside him, Echo paced in a tight circle, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, picking up the distant sirens that were growing louder. Mason checked his watch. He had been running for 20 minutes, doubling back through the labyrinth of the city to shake the pursuit. But he couldn't keep this up. He needed medical supplies, and he couldn't walk into an emergency room. A gunshot wound would trigger an automatic police report, and Mason knew Detective Miller and the Chicago PD were compromised or at least indifferent enough to hand him over to Black Ridge. He needed an off-the-books solution. His mind flashed back to the bus ride to the Blue Scrubs and the ID badge hanging from the exhausted woman's neck. Elena Rossetti, St. Jude's Medical Center. It was a gamble, perhaps a foolish one, but Mason was out of options. St. Jude's was only 6 blocks away. He tightened the improvised tourniquet he'd made from a strip of his shirt and signaled Echo. They moved through the shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfares where blue lights flashed against the buildings. The hospital loomed ahead, a fortress of glass and concrete. Mason didn't use the main entrance. Instead, he navigated to the delivery bay, slipping in behind a laundry truck as the driver argued with a guard. He moved through the service corridors, relying on the layout commonality of institutional buildings. He found the locker rooms near the surgical wing, hoping Elena was still on shift or had just started a new unlock. A rare commodity for him lately held out. He heard voices, waited for silence, and then slipped into the women's locker room, signaling Echo to guard the door from the inside. Elena was there, sitting on a bench with her head in her hands, staring at a phone screen that displayed the viral video of the bus hero. When Mason stepped into the light, Elena gasped, dropping her phone. She scrambled back, grabbing a can of hairspray from her open locker as a weapon. Quiet Mason hissed, raising his good hand. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm the guy from the bus." Elena froze, her eyes widening as she recognized the beard and the piercing eyes, and then the German shepherd standing silently by the door. Her gaze dropped to his blood-soaked sleeve. "You're shot," she whispered. "The medical training overriding the fear. Why are you here? The police are looking for you. They say you killed someone?" Mason grimaced, leaning against the lockers as the adrenaline began to crash. "I didn't kill anyone. My brother was murdered. The people who did it are trying to kill me too. I just need a needle and thread. Elena, please." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the violence the news reported, but finding only desperation and exhaustion. She lowered the hairspray. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice trembling but firm. Elena worked quickly, her hands steady. Despite the bizarre situation, she cleaned the wound with antiseptic from her personal kit and began stitching the furrowed flesh as she worked. Mason remained stoic, barely flinching. His name was Ethan. Mason said quietly, breaking the silence. He was a journalist. Elena's hands paused. She looked up, her brow furrowed. "Ethan Lewis, the freelance writer." Mason nodded. Elena swallowed hard, her face paling. "I saw him," she murmured. 2 days ago, he was in the cafeteria downstairs. I remember because he was arguing with someone, and he looked terrified." Mason grabbed her wrist gently. "Who was he with Elena?" Think she closed her eyes, recalling the memory. "A man older, bald. He had a tattoo on his neck right behind the ear. A cobra with a knife through it. I noticed it because he turned his collar up to hide it. When I walked by, Mason's blood ran cold. The cobra tattoo was the insignia of a specific elite unit within Black Ridge's Wetwork Division, it confirmed. Everything Ethan hadn't just stumbled onto a story. He had been meeting a whistleblower, or a threat, directly. That man Mason said is named Vance. He's the one hunting me before Elena could respond. The hospital's PA system chimed, but instead of a doctor's page, a harsh, mechanical voice announced, "Code Silver lockdown in effect. All personnel remain in your designated areas." Echo stood up, a low growl rumbling in his throat directed at the locker room door. Mason pulled away from Elena, checking the bandage she had just finished. "They're here," he said. "They tracked me, probably facial recognition, on the street cameras outside in the security control room of the hospital." Vance stood behind the terrified head of security. Vance was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite, his bald head gleaming under the fluorescent lights, the cobra tattoo hidden beneath a tactical turtleneck. He watched the monitors with predatory intensity. There, Vance pointed to a camera feed from the service corridor he entered. 20 minutes ago. Sector 4. Seal the exits. I want my team on every stairwell. No witnesses. He turned to his men, a group of heavily armed mercenaries disguised in SWAT uniforms. "The woman is with him. She's a loose end. Clean it up back in the locker room." Mason grabbed Elena's arm. "We have to move if you stay here. They'll kill you for helping me." Elena looked at the door, then back at Mason. The reality of her quiet life shattering was overwhelming, but the steel in Mason's eyes gave her an anchor. "The loading dock," she said breathlessly. "There's a trash chute that bypasses the security doors." Mason nodded. Echo lead. They burst into the hallway just as the elevator doors at the far end dinged open. Two men in SWAT gear stepped out raising rifles. They weren't police. Their stance was wrong, aggressive rather than defensive contact. One yelled. Mason didn't hesitate. He shoved Elena behind a heavy linen cart and kicked it down the hall toward the shooters as the cart rattled forward, drawing T. Air fire! Mason gave a sharp whistle. Echo launched himself like a missile, a blur of fur and teeth. The dog hit the first mercenary in the chest, knocking him backward into his partner. The rifle clattered to the floor as the man screamed Echo's jaws, locking onto his tactical vest and dragging him down. Mason sprinted forward, using the confusion to close the distance. He tackled the second man, using the momentum to drive him into the wall. A quick, brutal struggle ensued, ending with Mason disarming the man and delivering a knockout blow with the butt of the rifle. He whistled again, and Echo released the first man, who was now terrified and scrambling back. "Leave him," Mason ordered. "Go." They reached the laundry room, the sounds of shouting and boots echoing through the corridors behind them. Elena unlocked the heavy service door with her badge, her hands shaking violently. "It's a drop," she warned into the dumpster. Mason looked at her. "Trust me." He lifted her up, helping her climb into the chute, then tossed Echo down before sliding in himself. They landed in a pile of semi-clean linens in a large dumpster in the sub-basement loading bay. The air was freezing, but they were outside the perimeter. Mason helped Elena out, scanning the alley. A black van was idling at the gate, blocking the exit. "Can you drive?" Mason asked, nodding toward a hospital delivery van parked nearby with the keys still in the ignition, a common negligence in secure bays. Elena nodded, wiping grime from her face. "Yes." Mason opened the passenger door for her. "Get in. Keep your head down." He vaulted into the driver's seat, Echo scrambling into the back as Mason gunned the engine. The mercenaries at the gate realized what was happening and raised their weapons. Mason didn't brake. He floored the accelerator, the delivery van roaring as it smashed through the wooden arm of the gate and clipped the black SUV, spinning it around. Bullets pinged off the back doors, but they were through. They sped out onto the icy streets, disappearing into the traffic of the Chicago night. Mason looked at Elena. She was terrified, her life irrevocably changed, but she was alive, and she was the only witness who could link Vance to Ethan. The alliance was formed not by choice, but by survival. The stolen delivery van rattled violently as it bounced over the frozen ruts of an access road on the desolate southern edge of Lake Michigan. The city skyline was a distant glowing smear behind them, replaced by the skeletal silhouettes of abandoned steel mills and shipping warehouses that lined the dark water. Mason drove with the headlights off, navigating by the ambient moonlight reflecting off the snow. His eyes straining against the gloom beside him, Elena sat in silence. Her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring out at the bleak industrial wasteland in the back. Echo paced restlessly, his claws clicking on the metal floor, sensing the lingering adrenaline in the air. Mason pulled the vehicle into the cavernous gaping maw of a dilapidated structure known as the Foundry. It was a massive hollowed-out relic of the industrial age, a place Mason knew intimately. Years ago, before deployments took him to deserts and mountains, this had been an unofficial training ground for his SEAL team, a place to practice urban movement in freezing conditions away from prying eyes. Mason killed the engine, and the silence that rushed in was heavy and cold. "We stay here for a few hours," Mason said, his voice echoing slightly in the cab. "It's off the grid, thick walls, no cameras, we can regroup." He hopped out, sliding the side door open for Elena. She stepped down her legs, wobbling slightly. The reality of the night crashing down on her. The warehouse was freezing the air, smelling of rust and damp concrete. Mason guided them to a small enclosed office structure on a mezzanine level that offered a vantage point over the main floor. He broke open a rusted locker where his team used to stash emergency supplies, finding a few thermal blankets and a battery-operated lantern T. Hat surprisingly still flickered to life. They settled onto the floor, huddling under the blankets for the first time since the hospital. The frantic pace slowed, leaving space for the weight of the situation to settle. Mason checked the dressing on his shoulder, wincing slightly. Elena watched him, her professional instincts kicking in. "Let me check it," she offered quietly as she adjusted the bandage. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were haunted. "You're used to this?" she said. It wasn't a question. The violence the running Mason looked at her, seeing the fatigue etched into her features. "You never get used to running," he replied, "but you learn to function inside it." The conversation drifted to the reason they were there. Ethan was the good one. Mason admitted, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "I was the one who broke things. Ethan wanted to fix them. He thought the truth was enough to save people." He looked at the darkened ceiling. He was naive, but he was better than me. Elena shook her head slowly. "I'm a surgeon, Mason. I spend my life trying to keep people from dying. I stitch them up, restart their hearts. But tonight, watching you fight those men, I realized there are things in this world that surgery can't fix." She looked at her hands. I felt helpless. "I hate that feeling." Mason turned to her, his expression serious, then stopped being helpless. "You're a target now, Elena. As long as you're with me, you're in the war." He stood up and pulled a Sig Sauer P226 pistol from his waistband, a weapon he had confiscated from the mercenary. At the hospital, he checked the magazine and handed it to her. It was heavy in her hands, a cold alien object. "It's not a scalpel," Mason said. "Point squeeze, don't hesitate. If they come through that door, you shoot until the slide locks back." He spent the next hour teaching her the basics: grip, stance, safety. He showed her how to use a tactical knife he had in his boot, demonstrating the angles of attack. It was a grim lesson stripped of any cinematic glory. It was about survival. Elena absorbed it with the intense focus of a student used to high pressure. Learning her fear, hardening into resolve, their respite was cut short by a sound that made the hair on Mason's arms stand up. Echo, who had been sleeping by the door, suddenly lifted his head. The dog's ears swiveled forward, and a low vibrating growl started deep in his chest. Mason killed the lantern instantly, plunging them into darkness. "How many?" he whispered to the dog. Echo gave 2 sharp barks, then a pause, then another, 3 distinct groups. Mason moved to the edge of the mezzanine, peering through the cracked glass of the office window below. On the main floor of the warehouse, beams of tactical flashlights were cutting through the gloom. They swept over the rusted machinery and empty crates. The hunters had arrived. "Stay here." Mason breathed into Elena's ear. "Keep the gun pointed at the door. Do not fire unless they come inside." He slipped a pair of panoramic night vision goggles over his eyes gear. He had scavenged from the tactical bag of the SWAT team leader back at the hospital. The world turned into a crisp green-hued landscape. He looked at Echo and gave a silent hand signal the dog understood. This was the game they had played 100 times in training, but this time the targets were breathing. Mason slipped over the railing, dropping silently to the concrete floor below. He moved like a wraith, his footsteps masked by the ambient wind whistling through the broken skylights. The team of mercenaries, 6 men LED by a squad leader named Kruger, moved in a tactical formation. Kruger was a massive man with a jagged scar across his nose, barking orders into a radio fan. "Out-check the upper levels. Vance wants them alive for questioning. But if the dog gives you trouble, put it down." Mason reached the main breaker box on the far wall with a savage yank. He pulled the master lever. The few perimeter security lights that had been buzzing outside died, and the warehouse was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The mercenaries shouted, in confusion, their flashlights swinging wildly. Lights cut the lights. Kruger yelled, "Switch to thermal." But before they could adjust, the hunt began. Mason moved with the terrifying speed of a predator. In his natural element, he approached the straggler of the group, a man guarding the rear. Mason clamped a hand over the man's mouth and drove his knife into the gap between the tactical vest and the neck. He lowered the body silently to the floor, one down across the room. Echo barked a sharp, aggressive sound that echoed from the rafters, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. Over there, one mercenary shouted, spinning around and firing blindly into the dark. The muzzle flashes illuminated the room in strobe light bursts, revealing nothing. Echo was moving fast, running along the tops of the shipping containers, barking and growling to disorient the squad. He was herding them, separating the group. Two mercenaries moved toward the sound, isolating themselves from the main pack. Mason was waiting. He dropped from atop a forklift landing behind them. He struck the first man with the heavy pommel of his knife, shattering the base of his skull. The second man turned, but Mason was already inside his guard, sweeping his legs and finishing him with a precise strike to the throat. Panic began to set in among the remaining men. They were shooting at shadows, terrified of the invisible threat regroup. Kruger screamed back to back, but it was too late. Echo launched himself from the darkness, slamming into a mercenary's arm, his jaws crushing the forearm bone. The man screamed, dropping his weapon. Mason used the distraction to close in on Kruger. The squad leader fired his rifle, but Mason slid across the floor, coming up under the barrel. He slashed the knife upward, severing the sling of the rifle, and then drove a knee into Kruger's groin as the giant man doubled over. Mason delivered a spinning elbow strike to the temple that dropped him like a stone. Silence returned to the warehouse, broken only by the whimpers of the injured men and the heavy breathing of the mercenaries who were now unconscious. Or worse, Mason stood over them, the green glow of his goggles fading as he lifted them. He retrieved a radio from Kruger's vest, listening to the static status. Kruger report. A voice crackled. Vance Mason keyed the mic, his voice flat and cold. "Your men are done. Come send the next batch." He crushed the radio in his hand. He whistled, and Echo trotted to his side, blood on his muzzle, but tail wagging slightly. Mason looked up at the mezzanine. Elena was standing at the window, the gun lowered. She had watched the flashes of violence, the efficiency of the slaughter. She wasn't just a surgeon anymore. She was a survivor. Mason climbed back up, wiping the blade of his knife on his pants. "We have to go," he said, his chest heaving slightly. "They know exactly where we are now." They gathered their meager supplies and vanished into the night, leaving the broken squad in the freezing dark of the foundry. The silence in the foundry was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of Kruger. The mercenary squad leader Mason had left conscious. For a reason, the other men lay groaning in the darkness, incapacitated but alive, a mercy they didn't deserve. But one. Mason granted to avoid crossing a line he could never uncross. Mason dragged Kruger by his tactical vest into the small office, where the lantern still flickered, casting long dancing shadows against the grime-streaked glass. Elena stood by the door, the cig sour heavy in her hands, her face pale, but her eyes hardened by the night's violence. Mason didn't shout. He didn't hit the man again. He simply knelt, bringing his face close to the bloody broken nose of the mercenary. The shipment, Mason said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated with lethal intent. "Project Ares. Where is it going?" And when Kruger spat blood onto the concrete, trying to summon a smirk that faltered under Mason's flinty gaze. "You're dead, SEAL!" Kruger wheezed. "You don't know who you're playing with. Silas will burn this whole city to find you." Mason didn't blink. He pressed his thumb into a pressure point on Kruger's shoulder, not enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to send a bolt of white-hot agony through the man's nervous system. Kruger arched his back, gasping the tower. He choked out Black Ridge HQ, the penthouse helipad. The shipment moves in 2 hours. Direct flight to a private airfield in Venezuela. Mason released him, standing up and wiping his hands. He had the location. Black Ridge Tower was a glass monolith in the heart of the financial district, a fortress of corporate power. He looked at Elena. "We have a timeline, but before they moved, Mason needed to make a call. He had been dreading. He pulled a burner phone from his pack, one he kept for dire emergencies, and dialed a number that didn't exist in any public directory. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. This line is dead. Mason turned his back to Elena. It's Mason. I need an extraction breaker. I've got a civilian in intel on a domestic terror operation run by Black Ridge. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end. The man, Lieutenant Commander Cole, known as Breaker, was Mason's former commanding officer, a man of absolute integrity. Or so Mason believed. Mason Cole's voice was strained. Tired. Listen to me? Carefully drop the phone. Walk away. The agency is compromised. Black Ridge has insiders in the Senate and the DOD. If I send a team, they won't be coming to rescue you. They'll be coming to sanitize the scene. Mason's grip on the phone tightened until the plastic creaked. They killed Ethan Breaker. They're selling missiles to cartels. Cole sighed a sound of defeat. I know, son, but I can't stop it if you go after Silas. You're on your own. I can't protect you. The line went dead. Mason stared at the phone for a second before crushing it under his boot. He was truly alone. The realization brought a strange clarity. He turned to Elena. We're leaving. He drove the stolen van to a Seki, looted cash-only motel on the outskirts of the city, a place called the Blue Voyager with flickering neon signs and no cameras. He paid for a room, checking it for bugs with a practice sweep. You stay here, Mason ordered, handing her the key and a fresh magazine for the pistol lock. The door, do not open it for anyone but me or Echo. Elena grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his jacket. You're going to the tower. That's suicide. Mason, let me call the FBI. The news someone? Mason shook his head, his expression softening slightly as he looked at her. The police are bought. The news won't run it without proof. I have to get the physical drive from the source. I have to stop that shipment. He knelt down and looked Echo in the eye. Watch her, he commanded the dog, whined low in his throat, but sat down next to Elena. His loyalty torn, but his obedience absolute. Mason stood up, feeling a pang of guilt. He was leaving her in the only safety he could provide, hoping it was enough. If I'm not back in 4 hours, he said, you run. Don't look back. Mason moved through the city like a ghost, arriving at the Black Ridge Tower just as the snow began to fall harder. Masking the streets in white, the building was a fortress. 70 stories of steel and arrogance. He didn't take the front door, using the maintenance schematics he had memorized from Ethan's files. He accessed the underground service tunnels, bypassing the thermal sensors by moving through the steam outflow pipes, a dangerous, suffocating climb that left him drenched in sweat. Despite the freezing temperatures, he emerged in the mechanical room on the 68th floor, slipping past the patrols with the silence of a shadow. He didn't kill anyone. He didn't want to raise the alarm yet. He choked out a guard near the executive elevator, taking his keycard, and ascended to the penthouse. The doors opened with a soft chime into a space that smelled of expensive leather and old money. The penthouse was a sprawling open concept with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking T.H. glittering city. Standing by the window, staring out at the snowstorm, was a man who looked nothing like the mercenaries Mason had fought. Silas Blackwood, the CEO of Black Ridge, was a man of slight build, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Mason made in a year. He had silver hair slicked back perfectly and wore rimless glasses that magnified eyes as cold and dead as a shark's. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch, his posture relaxed, showing no surprise as Mason stepped into the room, his gun raised. Mr. Lewis, Silas said, not turning around. His voice was smooth, cultured, devoid of fear. You're quieter than your brother. Ethan had a habit of stomping around asking loud questions. Mason leveled the pistol at the back of Silas's head. Turn around hands where I can see them. Silas turned slowly, sipping his drink. He looked at the gun with mild amusement. So pedestrian, you think a bullet solves this. You think killing me stops the shipment. Mason stepped closer, his finger tightening on the trigger. It stops you. Tell me the encryption key for the Ares files. Now, Silas chuckled, walking over to his desk and sitting down. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Please sit. You look exhausted. I'm not here to chat. Mason growled. You killed my brother. Silas sighed, placing his drink on a coaster. Your brother was a glitch in the system. Mason, a necessary correction, just like you are. But I must admit, I admire your tenacity. Taking out Vans. Squad. Impressive. Silas leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Mason's. But you're a hammer looking for a nail, and I am not a nail. I am the architect. Mason stepped around the desk, pressing the gun barrel to Silas's forehead. The encryption key. Or, I paint this office with your brains. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. You won't shoot me, Mason, because you're a protector. It's your fatal flaw. Silas tapped a key on his sleek laptop, and a monitor on the wall flickered to life. The screen showed a live feed. It was the interior of a motel room. The blue Voyager Elena was pacing by the bed, Echo watching the door. Mason's heart stopped. How he whispered. Silas shrugged. We tracked the van's GPS before you disabled it. I have a second-team LED by my head of security. Jack's sitting in the parking lot. Right now, they are waiting for my signal. Silas leaned back, spreading his hands. So here is the deal, soldier. You put the gun down, you surrender the SD card you took from your brother, and you let the shipment fly, and I let the girl live. Or you pull that trigger, and Jax turns that motel room into a slaughterhouse before your casing hits the floor. Mason stared at the screen. Then at Silas. The manipulator had checkmated him. The gun in Mason's hand felt suddenly incredibly heavy. He had walked into the snake's den, only to find the snake was already coiled around everything he had left, to lose the standoff in the penthouse, hung by a thread as thin as spider silk. Mason Lewis stood with his pistol leveled at the forehead of Silas Blackwood, but the gun felt useless against the suffocating weight of the surveillance screen on the wall. The image of the motel room flickered, but something was wrong. Mason squinted his combat instincts, screaming that the picture was static. A loop Silas noticed the shift in Mason's eyes, and his smile widened, revealing teeth that looked too white, too perfect. You're wondering why she isn't moving, Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You are wondering if I am bluffing. I told you, Mr. Lewis, I am the architect. I don't rely on remote teams when I can have the pieces right here on the board. Silas pressed a button on his desk, and the heavy oak doors to the right of the room groaned open. Mason's heart hammered against his ribs as two figures emerged from the shadows of the adjoining room. The first was a mountain of a man named Jax, standing nearly 7 feet tall. Jax was a grotesque monument to steroid-enhanced violence, wearing a tactical vest that oaked like a child's bib on his massive chest. His head was shaved, revealing a lattice of scars, and his eyes were dull, devoid of humanity, signaling a man who felt no pain and no remorse. He was dragging Elena by her hair. She was bruised, her lip bleeding, but she was alive, her eyes locking onto Mason's with a mix of terror and apology. I tried to follow. She gasped before Jax jerked her, roughly silencing her, but what broke Mason's composure was not Elena, but what followed. 2 other guards pushed a heavy steel mesh cage into the room inside. Echo was pacing frantically, slamming his body against the bars he wore, a heavy industrial-grade shock collar that hummed with menacing energy. Every time the dog lunged, a guard pressed a remote, and a blue arc of electricity snapped, forcing Echo to the floor with a yelp that tore through Mason's soul. Put the gun down. Mason Silas commanded the amusement, gone from his voice. Or Jax breaks her neck. Then we cook the dog. Your choice. Mason looked at Elena, then at Echo. The calculation took a fraction of a second. He couldn't shoot 3 people before Jax snapped Elena's spine slowly, agonizingly. Mason lowered the SIG. Sour, he engaged the safety and placed it on the floor, kicking it toward the desk. Let them go, Mason said, raising his hands. You want me? You have me? Silas laughed, a dry rattling sound. Oh, I don't just want you. I want the insurance, the SD card, and I want you to suffer for the mess you made at my foundry. He nodded to Jax. Soften him up. Jax released Elena, shoving her into a heap near the window, and turned toward Mason. The giant moved with surprising speed for his size. Mason tried to defend himself, raising his arms to block, but Jack's fist hit him like a wrecking ball. The impact lifted Mason off his feet, sending him crashing into a glass display case. Shards of glass rained down as Mason groaned. Tasting copper, he tried to rise, but Jack's was already there, delivering a brutal kick to the ribs that Mason felt crack. This wasn't a fig. It was an execution. Mason, a trained SEAL, was forced to endure the beating without fighting back, knowing that any resistance would result in Elena's death. Blow after blow rained down, turning Mason's face into a mask of blood through the haze of pain. Mason heard Elena screaming for them to stop, and the sickening sound of the electric collar buzzing as Echo tried desperately to get to his handler. Finally, Jax grabbed Mason by the throat and hauled him up, slamming him onto his knees in front of Silas's desk. Mason swayed his vision, blurring blood dripping from his chin onto the expensive Persian rug. Silas walked around the desk, holding out a manicured hand. "The card, Mason, give it to me, and I'll make the end quick for all of you." Mason coughed, spitting a glob of blood onto Silas's polished shoe. Silas looked down with disgust, then nodded to Jack's hold. Jax grabbed Mason's arms, pinning them behind his back with a grip that felt like hydraulic clamps. A guard stepped forward with heavy-duty zip ties, binding Mason's wrists so tightly the plastic bit into the bone. "The card is in my pocket." Mason wheezed, his head hanging low. "Left pocket." Silas smirked, leaning in close. "See, was that so hard? Obedience is such a virtue." Silas reached into Mason's jacket pocket, but Mason wasn't reaching for the card in his mind. He was focusing on the small rectangular device hidden in his inner lining, a prototype military signal jammer. He had swiped from the mercenary Combs bag back at the hospital. It was designed to disrupt short-range frequencies, radio cellular, and most importantly, unshielded electronics. Closer, Mason whispered. "Come get it." As Silas's fingers brushed the fabric, Mason surged forward with the last reserve of his strength. He didn't headbutt. Silas, he threw his body weight against the desk, knocking a heavy bronze statue onto the floor to create a distraction, and simultaneously crushed the activation button of the jammer through the fabric of his coat. A high-pitched whine, audible. Only to the younger guards, and the dog pierced the air. The effect was instantaneous. The lights in the penthouse flickered and died as the smart system crashed. The electronic locks on the doors disengaged with a clack, and crucially, the remote control for the shock collar in the guard's hand sparked and failed the magnetic lock on Echo's cage. Dead cycled the door, popping open an inch. That was all the German Shepherd needed, with a roar that sounded more like a wolf than a dog. Echo burst from the cage. He didn't go for the guards. He went for the biggest threat. Echo launched himself across the room, a black missile in the gloom, and clamped his jaws onto Jax's forearm. The giant roared in surprise and pain, his grip on Mason loosening instinctively as he tried to shake off 80 pounds of fury. Mason didn't waste the millisecond he dropped to the floor, rolling onto his back and bringing his bound hands up toward Echo. "Sonder," he screamed the command for cut or break. The dog, trained for years to deal with restraints in field capture scenarios, released Jack's arm and lunged at Mason to the untrained eye. It looked like an attack, but Echo's teeth found the plastic zip ties with a savage head shaking. Ripped the dog's powerful jaws sheared through the plastic, grazing Mason's wrists. But freeing him, Mason rolled to his feet, the pain in his ribs forgotten, replaced by the cold, lethal clarity of combat. Jax was recovering, pulling a massive combat knife from his belt. Silas was scrambling back in the dark, shouting for his backup. The trap had been sprung, but the hunter had forgotten that a cornered wolf is the most dangerous animal on Earth. Mason grabbed a shard of heavy plate glass from the floor, his eyes glowing in the dim emergency lighting. The odds were still impossible, but now he was unbound. The penthouse of the Black Ridge Tower had transformed from a sanctuary of high-level corruption into a slaughterhouse illuminated by the pulsating red strobes of the emergency lighting thing. "See?" Air, once scented with expensive cologne and old leather, was now thick with the acrid stench of ozone from the fried electronics and the metallic tang of blood. Silas Blackwood had vanished the moment the lights died, slipping through a concealed panic door behind his desk, like a cockroach scurrying from the light, leaving his men to clean up the mess. But he had severely miscalculated the nature of the mess he was leaving behind. He had assumed Mason Lewis was a broken man, softened by grief and restrained by morality. He was wrong. The man rising from the floor with a shard of heavy plate glass in his hand was not a civilian. He was a Tier 1 operator who had just been given permission to disengage his safety protocols. Jax, the behemoth head of security, was occupied for the briefest of seconds trying to dislodge Echo the German Shepherd, despite the burns on his neck from the shock collar, fought with a feral intensity, his teeth tearing at the Kevlar weaving of Jax's tactical vest. Jax roared a sound of pure primal rage and swung his massive arm, backhanding the 80-pound dog with enough force to send Echo skidding across the polished floor, crashing into a marble pedestal. Echo yelped, but scrambled to his feet, favoring his left leg, snarling and ready to re-engage, but the distraction had bought Mason the opening he needed. 3 uniformed guards burst through the main doors, their weapons raised, confused by the strobing lights and the chaos. Mason didn't wait for them to assess the situation. He moved with a terrifying fluid aggression. He sprinted toward the first guard, sliding on his knees across the Persian rug to duck under a spray of submachine gun fire that shattered the window behind him. Mason rose inside the guard's personal space, driving the shard of glass into the gap of the man's body armor as the man crumpled. Mason grabbed the falling MP5 submachine gun, spun and fired 2 controlled bursts. The second and third guards dropped before they could even locate the target. It was a display of violence so efficient it looked choreographed, a dance of death honed by a decade of shadow. "Wars, Elena, get down!" Mason shouted, his voice cutting through the din of gunfire. Elena Rossetti was huddled behind an overturned sofa, her hands over her ears, the reality of the war zone crashing down on her. She saw Mason moving through the room, a silhouette against the flashing red lights, dismantling the squad of mercenaries Silas had kept in reserve. He was a blur of motion, using the environment, overturning heavy oak tables for cover, shooting out the remaining decorative lights to plunge sections of the room into total darkness, forcing the guards to fight on his terms. But the numbers were against him. More men were pouring in from the hallway. Mason took a hit to his vest, a stray round that cracked a rib. He was sure was already broken, but he didn't slow down. He was running low on ammo. He tossed the empty MP5 and drew the combat knife he had taken from the first guard. A mercenary lunged at him from the shadows. Mason parried. The rifle barrel stepped in and delivered a palm strike to the chin that snapped the man's head back, followed by a sweep that put him on the floor in the chaos. A guard who had been feigning injury near the entrance pushed himself up. He raised his pistol, aiming squarely at Mason's exposed back, while the SEAL was engaged with another opponent. Mason wouldn't see it coming, but Elena did. The surgeon, whose hands had spent a lifetime mending flesh, looked at the pistol lying on the floor near her, Mason's discarded SIG. Sour, her hands were shaking uncontrollably, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She thought of Ethan, of the cruelty she had witnessed, of the man who was fighting an army alone to save her. The fear didn't vanish, but it was eclipsed by a cold resolve. Elena grabbed the gun. It was heavier than she remembered from the practice in the warehouse. She didn't have the perfect stance Mason had taught her, but she had to. He angled. She leveled the weapon, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked violently in her hand. The shot went wide of the chest, but struck the guard in the thigh. He screamed, dropping his aim, and Mason spun around, finishing the threat with a single knife throw. He looked at Elena, giving her a single fierce nod of acknowledgement. She had stepped into the arena, but the battle wasn't over. A massive hand grabbed Mason by the back of his tactical vest and hurled him across the room like a rag doll. Mason crashed into the heavy oak desk, splintering the wood. He groaned, rolling over to see Jax looming over him. The giant had discarded his shredded vest and weapons. He wanted to do this with his hands. Jax was a sadist who enjoyed the intimate crunch of bone. He cracked his knuckles, a grin splitting his scarred face. "You're fast, little man." Jax rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly. "But you break just like the rest." Mason stood up, spitting blood. He was battered, bleeding, and exhausted, but his eyes were burning with a cold blue fire. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. Jax was the barrier between him and the man who ordered his brother's death. "Come on," Mason whispered, raising his fists in a classic boxing stance. Jax charged like a bull. He threw a haymaker that could have taken a head off. Mason ducked under it, delivering 2 rapid hooks to Jax's liver. It was like punching a concrete wall. Jax barely flinched and slammed a knee into Mason's stomach. The air exploded from Mason's lungs. Jax grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground, and slammed him against the wall. "Where's that seal? Toughness?" Now Jax taunted. Squeezing Mason's vision began to tunnel. He clawed at Jax's wrist, but it was iron. He looked into Jax's eyes and saw the soulless void that had extinguished Ethan's life. That thought was the fuel. Mason didn't try to overpower the grip. Instead, he drove his thumbs deep into the bundle of nerves on the inside of Jax's elbow. Jax's arms spasmed involuntarily, loosening the grip. Just enough, Mason dropped, gasping, and instantly exploded upward. He drove the heel of his boot into Jax's knee, hyperextending the joint with a sickening pop. Jax roared, not in anger this time, but in agony. Stumbling back, he was hurt. The monster was mortal. Mason didn't let up. He unleashed a flurry of strikes. Elbows, knees, palm strikes targeting the soft tissue, the throat, the eyes, the solar plexus. He was faster, sharper, a scalpel, dismantling a boulder. Jax tried to grab him, swinging wildly, but Mason was gone, slipping behind him. Mason jumped, wrapping his arm around Jax's thick neck in a rear-naked choke. Jax thrashed, throwing himself backward to crush Mason against the wall, but Mason held on, locking his legs around the giant's waist. He squeezed, cutting off the blood flow to the brain. "This is for Ethan!" Mason snarled into Jax's ear. Jax struggled his face, turning a mottled purple, his hands clawing at Mason's arms, tearing skin, but the grip was absolute. Slowly the fight drained out of the giant. His arms fell to his sides, his knees buckled, the massive body slumped to the floor, unconscious. Mason didn't stop there. He knew men like Jax didn't stay down. He shifted his grip, and with a violent, definitive twist of his hips and shoulders, he snapped the giant's neck. The crack echoed through the room, louder than the gunshots. Mason rolled off the body lying on the floor for a second. His chest-heaving silence returned to the penthouse, save for the hum of the red emergency lights. He stood up, swaying. Echo limped over to him, licking the blood from his hand. Elena emerged from behind the sofa, still holding the gun. Her face pale, but Drygo, she said, pointing to the open panic door behind the desk where the cold wind was rushing in. He went to the roof. Mason nodded, wiping the sweat and blood from his eyes. He checked his gear. No ammo, just the knife and his will. He looked at Elena barricade the door truss. Echo he turned and sprinted toward Day. He panicked door up the spiral maintenance stairs that led to the helipad. The sound of a turbine engine whining to life grew louder with every step. Silas was trying to fly away from his sins, but Mason Lewis was bringing the judgment of the earth up to the sky. The fury hadn't burned out. It had just focused into a single piercing point. The freezing wind on the rooftop of Black Ridge Tower screamed like a banshee, tearing at Mason's clothes as he burst through the heavy access door 50 yards away. The sleek black helicopter was already light on its skids, the turbine engine whining into a high-pitched shriek. The downwash from the rotors kicked up a blinding vortex of snow and ice crystals, stinging Mason's face. But he didn't blink. He saw Silas Blackwood sitting in the plush leather seat of the rear cabin, looking out the window with a glass of scotch still in his hand, a look of smug, untouchable victory on his face. He thought he had won. He thought the sky was his escape route. Mason sprinted, his lungs burned, his ribs screamed with every stride, but his legs pumped with the rhythmic power of a machine. The helicopter lifted 5 feet, 10 feet, drifting away from the edge of the helipad toward the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. Mason didn't slow down. He hit the edge of the roof and launched himself into the void. For a terrifying second, he was weightless, suspended between the skyscraper and the icy black water far below. Then his gloved hands slammed into the cold metal of the landing skid. The impact wrenched his shoulders, threatening to tear his grip loose. But he held on, swinging wildly as the aircraft banked sharply to the left. Inside, Silas dropped his drink, his eyes widening in horror as he saw the figure dangling from his getaway vehicle. He pounded on the partition, screaming at the pilot to shake him off. The pilot, a hired mercenary, jerked the cyclic control, sending the helicopter into a violent sway. Mason gritted his teeth, wrapping his legs around the skid, inching his way toward the cabin door. The wind was a physical force trying to peel him away, but Mason was fueled by a promise he had made to a ghost. He wasn't letting go. He reached the door handle, yanked it open, and hauled himself inside. The sudden shift in weight and the open door destabilized the aircraft further. Silas lunged at him, wielding a heavy fire extinguisher from the cabin wall. It was a desperate, clumsy attack. Mason deflected the blow with his forearm and drove a punch into Silas's stomach, doubling him over, but in the scuffle, they crashed against the pilot's seat. The pilot shouted, losing control, as Mason's boot inadvertently slammed into the collective lever, dropping the pitch of the rotors. Instantly, the engine screamed in protest. The helicopter, already flying low and erratic due to the storm, dropped like a stone. The dark, churning surface of Lake Michigan rushed up to meet them. "Brace," Mason yelled, grabbing Silas by the collar, not to save him, but to ensure he didn't escape the judgment. Waiting below the impact was like hitting concrete. The helicopter smashed into the water, the rotors shattering instantly, sending shrapnel flying cold. Freezing darkness engulfed them, as the cabin flooded the shock of the water just a few degrees above. Freezing stole the breath from Mason's lungs. He was underwater, disoriented, the sinking wreckage pulling him down. He fought the panic, his SEAL training kicking in. Up, find up, he kicked free of the fuselage, his hand closing around the fabric of Silas's expensive suit. The CEO was unconscious, dead weight. Mason could have let him sink, let the lake swallow the architect of all this pain. But that wasn't justice. That was just murder. Ethan believed in the truth. The truth needed a witness. Mason kicked hard, dragging Silas with him, lungs burning for air until he broke the surface, gasping into the frigid night air. They were only a few hundred yards from the shoreline where the jagged ice met the concrete retaining wall. Mason swam one arm towing the VI, lane his body going numb. Every stroke was a battle against hypothermia. He reached the icy rocks and hauled Silas up onto the snow-covered path, collapsing beside him. His vision was blurring, his core temperature plummeting. He looked up expecting darkness. Instead, he saw blinding lights, blue and red strobes cut through the night. A dozen vehicles had screeched to a halt on the Lakeshore Drive. Access road men and windbreakers with FBI emblazoned on the back were swarming, the scene weapons drawn, but pointed at the ground. A man stepped forward, tall and sharp-featured, wearing a long trench coat and an expression of grim determination. This was Special Agent Reynolds, a federal officer known for his by-the-book rigidity. He looked down at Mason, then at the unconscious Silas. "Mason," Lewis Reynolds asked, his voice cutting through the wind. Mason nodded weakly, unable to stand. "We got the upload," Reynolds said, crouching down the Ares files. "They hit our secure server 10 minutes ago. Your brother?" He set a dead man switch on that drive. It decrypted automatically when you accessed it. At the cafe, set on a delay, Reynolds motioned to the paramedics who were rushing forward. "You're clear, sailor. We have everything we need. Silas Blackwood is going away for a very long time." Mason let his head drop back onto the snow. The adrenaline finally faded, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion. But for the first time in days, the weight on his chest was gone. The winter thaw came early that year. 3 months later, the sky over Chicago was a brilliant, piercing blue. The snow had melted, leaving the grass in the cemetery a vibrant green. Mason stood before a simple granite headstone. Ethan Lewis, brother-son. Truth-seeker, the grave was clean adorned with fresh flowers. Mason looked different. The beard was trimmed shorter. the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a quiet sorrow that was healing slowly. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He wore jeans and a simple jacket. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just a brother H. He felt a warm hand slip into his. Elena stood beside him, looking healthy and strong. The bruises from that night long faded. She squeezed his hand, a silent gesture of support. He would have liked the view, she said softly. Mason nodded. He would have written a story about how the city needs to maintain the grass better. He replied, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. At his feet, Echo sat majestically. The dog had healed fully. The fur grown back over the burns on his neck. His ears perked up, watching a squirrel dart up a nearby oak tree. Echo leaned his weight against Mason's leg, a solid grounding presence ready to go. Elena asked. Mason took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of damp earth and new life. Yeah, I'm ready. 6 months later, the sign above the converted warehouse on the outskirts of the city read Lewis K-9, Training and Rehabilitation. The facility was bustling inside the fenced yard. Mason was working with a young, aggressive Malinois, his movements calm and patient, guiding the dog with hand signals rather than force. He had taken his skill set, the discipline, the understanding of working dogs, and turned it into something constructive. He helped rehabilitate dogs that others had given up on, aggressive cases and trauma survivors. It was quiet work, good work. Elena pulled up in the driveway in her car. Waving from the window, she had finished her shift at the hospital and came by every evening. They weren't rushing things. They were building something slow and real, forged in the fire of what they had survived. Mason released the Malinois to his assistant and whistled. Echo, who had been supervising the session, from the porch like a regal king, bounded over. Mason jogged to the gate, greeting Elena with a kiss run. She asked run. He agreed. The final image was of the lakefront path as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the water. The city skyline, once a menacing cage of corruption, now just looked like home. Mason ran with an easy, loping stride, no longer running from ghosts or bullets. Beside him ran Elena, keeping pace, laughing at something he said, and ahead of them, both leading the way with his tail held high, was Echo. The silent guardian had finally found his peace. They ran into the horizon, not as soldiers or survivors, but as a family. If this story of courage and redemption touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with a friend who needs a reminder of their own strength. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a journey. Like this one, I pray that God blesses you with the heart of a warrior and the peace of a guardian. May He watch over you and your loved ones, protecting you from every danger and guiding your steps toward the light. If you believe in His protection and strength, please type Amen in the comments below. Stay strong and have a blessed day.